And I'm also sending through the chat a copy of the slides that Brad is going to share. So you'll have those. If you click on that file, you can download it to your hard drive. All right, so I want to introduce our main presenter. Most of you know Brad. Brad has been a tutor. I think he started as an ESL tutor just before COVID, so 4 or 5 years ago, and has been so willing to help with so many other things besides just tutoring a learner, including doing some of these workshops. Brad is a retired physics professor from Oakland University, so he is kind of a master teacher and obviously knows math very, very well. So he was willing to help do the seminar on August 22nd, which focused specifically on the math subject test of the GED. But I had asked him if he could also take a look at the math that is required on the non-math parts of the GED. The GED has the reading, social studies, and science subject test, but within social studies and science, there is some math knowledge required. So to the extent that you as math tutors can help with that, that would be awesome, because our reading tutors may not feel that comfortable with those math type questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad to take it away.
All right, let me share my screen and start reading view. Okay, so Warren unfortunately isn't here, but today we're going to talk about math in the GED Science and Social Studies exams. And this is a real small group, so as you have questions, just pipe right up and ask them. There's my email. If you want to have questions later, if you think of something, feel free to email me and to ask. And you all were doing sort of introductions before, but I thought maybe we just do it a little more formally, give your name, where you're at. And what I'm particularly interested in is what you want to accomplish today, so I can make sure that we're accomplishing your goals. So I'll start. I'm Brad Roth, and I was just introduced, but I'm here in Rochester Hills. And what I want to try to accomplish today is to try to explain the math that's on the science and social studies GED tests. So maybe Pat, you could go next.
Okay. Hi, I'm Pat Eggleston, and I'm the program coordinator for Oakland Literacy. And I started with Oakland Literacy April 8th of this year. But it seems like I've been here a lot longer. And I enjoy helping the learners and working with the tutors.
Great. How about you, Carol?
I'm Carol Johnson. I live in Rochester Hills, and I'm a retired engineer from GM. Although I have been involved in tutoring for a number of years, I have not tutored in math before. I've only focused on reading. So at the moment, my student and I are still working on reading, but math is going to be coming up. So I'm trying to just get kind of a feel for what needs to be done and how to do it.
Okay. Stuart.
I'm Stuart McMillan. I'm in Bloomfield Hills. I'm a retired finance manager in manufacturing. And I really want to understand what math is included or required in those other tests, because the students that I've worked with and the one that I'm working with now are in the process of going through those exact tests as we're learning the math part of it.
Okay. How about you, Ben?
So I'm Ben. I'm from Bloomfield as well. I am trying basically to learn more about what the GED math is, because I'm on my first student right now. So I haven't really seen anyone through to the finish line, and trying to get him through the finish line.
Great. And Leslie, welcome, and perhaps you can introduce yourself.
Yep, sorry I was a few minutes late there, and I'm gonna have to jump up and turn off my grilled cheese sandwich. Leslie Littell from Auburn Hills, and I'm working with a student who's trying to reach her GED. We're almost through reading. And the next step would be social studies. So I do want to think about what the math is relative to those next tests, the same as Stuart.
Okay, well, great. So I thought I would quickly review the topics that are on the science and the social studies tests. The science has 40% biology and medicine, 40% physics and chemistry, and then 20%, which is geology, astronomy, and what I'd call environmental science. And on the social studies, it's 50% government, 20% US history, 15% economics, and then 15%, which is geography and the world. I'd say that's geography and world history. So there's a lot of opportunities for math in these various subjects. So the real question is, what math is on the science and the social studies test? And
Sure.
Yep. So when I went on, I did some looking around in various books and websites and practice tests, and my main conclusion is that there's not a whole lot. There's very little, but there is some, and so that's what we're going to talk about is the small amount that is on there now this time. So I thought I'd give you an example. This could be one of the things that the students are going to have to be able to do is look at data and interpret tables or plots of data. And so this is an example you might see in American history test. Is the tests don't ask for a lot of knowledge of facts. They'll give you little segments you're supposed to read, maybe have some data built in, and ask you to interpret and answer questions about that. So since I made up a little example, here's some data about Civil War battles and a number of people killed in them. And then they'd have to ask some questions. Some of them might be real simple questions, like which battle had the largest number killed? Well, that's Gettysburg has got the biggest number. But they might ask other questions that are a little bit harder. Were more soldiers killed before or after the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, based on this data here from these 7 battles, you could add up all the number before and all the number after, but it's pretty clear that the 3 battles before Gettysburg, because these are listed chronologically, the 3 before, all those 3 numbers are smaller than the 3 after. So the answer would be there's more were killed after the battle. But sometimes you want to do some statistics. And when the GED talks about statistics, even on the math part of the GED, when they're talking about statistics, they're really talking about 4 quantities: the mean, the median, the mode, and the range. So what would we, if we were asked for the mean of number of people killed in each battle? What you do is you just add up the total number killed in all the 7 battles listed here, and you divide by 7, and you're going to get the mean, which is 4,202. So that's sometimes when they say mean, what they really mean is average. Those 2 words are used more or less the same. And then that's the mean. Now, how about the median? The median, to find the median, what you want to do is, well, first of all, when you're calculating the mean, you may need a calculator. To add up those numbers, a little hard to do by hand. There is one calculator that's allowed on the GED test. It's allowed on the math. It's also allowed on the social studies and science. It's the TI-30X. I can't quite see it here because people are in the way, but it's the one shown here on the right. I have a TI-30XA. It's a completely different calculator. So realize your students, when they're on the test, are going to have access to an online version of this calculator, and you want to have them practice with it. The last thing you want is to have your student having to learn how to use that calculator during a timed test. So you don't have to know a lot of fancy mathematics for the social science and the science tests, social studies and science tests, but you ought to have least be familiar with how you do simple operations with this particular calculator. They can go out and buy one if they want, but they will have access to an online one during the test. Okay, how about the median? What's the difference between the median and the mean? Well, what you do if you want the median is you list the data instead of chronologically like I've shown here, you'd write it in terms of number killed in order, with Gettysburg being the highest, then Spotsylvania and on down to Chancellorsville. And the median is just the middle number. So it's right there, the wilderness battle. So 3,723 would be the median. And it's like a typical number. Half the battles had less, half the battles had more. And if there happens to be an even number of data, you take the average of the two middle ones. But if there's an odd number, it's just the middle value. So that's the median and the mean. And sometimes with a mean can kind of get thrown off by one big outlier. So suppose you had 7 houses for sale, and 6 of them were $500,000 each, and there was a 7th was a giant mansion that was $35 million. Well, the mean is going to be pretty big. The mean is going to be basically 35 million divided by 7, or just a tiny bit more, which is 5 million. That wouldn't look like, that's not typical of any, no house in that list had that value. But the median would just be $500,000. It's just 6 of the 7 houses had that value. So a median gives you a kind of a typical value. Now, if you've lined the data up in order, and then it's easy to get the range, because the range is the largest minus the smallest. So in this case, you take 7,058 and you subtract 3,271, and the range would just be 3787. So
and
that's
again,
the meaning.
Can I butt in here? Sorry.
You can.
Again, you can use a calculator for this problem. So know how to add and subtract on the calculator.
Okay. And the person who just butted in is Warren. Maybe you could just introduce yourself for 1 second before we go on.
Hi, I'm Warren Block. I used to teach at Troy Athens math, and I've been OLCing for almost a half year now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And please, folks, if I say something that you don't understand, jump in, because there's just a handful of us.
So the student is expected to know what these terms all mean and how to calculate them. Is that correct?
I would say yes. On these 4 terms, they should know. So they don't need to know standard deviation. They don't need to know a normal distribution. They don't need to know how to do, t-tests to comparing things. For statistics, they just need 4 terms and what they are. In fact, the math test lets you have a formula sheet, and 2 of them are defined on it. But for the social studies and for the science, they really just have to memorize those 4 numbers. And it's a little tricky because 3 of them begin with M, but
Right.
you just have to basically have to know what those are. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And it's a little hard to show what the mode is with this data because there's no data that's given twice. So I'm going to show you the mode with another example. Suppose you had a set of data, and these were just given by 7 data points: 10, 8, 5, 6, 19, 6, 9. Now, it doesn't mean much if you don't have a context, but let's go ahead and calculate all 4 quantities. The mean, well, first of all, I always put the data in order. You don't really need to put the data in order from lowest to highest to calculate the mean, but the other 3, it makes life easier. So put them in order, lowest to highest. Then the mean is just going to be adding them up, dividing by 7. In this case, you get an integer 9. Other cases, you might get some decimal number. The median is the middle value, which in this case is just 8. The mode, now 6 is given twice. So the number that's given most often is the mode. So the mode in this case is 6. The mode isn't used too much, and sometimes it can be very deceiving because you might have some odd number that's given a few more times than other common numbers. But the definition of the mode is the value that's given most often. In this case, it's 6, and the range is 19 minus 5, so it's 14. So if you know those 4 numbers, you should be good with all the statistics that could come up on the tests. Okay. All right, now, this is an example that might come from, say, the environmental science section of the social studies test, or maybe the science test. This is the 2023 Michigan electricity generation in millions of megawatt hours. And remember, these are going to be questions. They're not going to ask you, how many megawatt hours generation of coal in 2023. They're not going to ask you a question like that. They're going to give you a little text with some data given and maybe a plot like this, and they're going to ask you to interpret it. So they might say, what percent of electrical generation is from fossil fuels? And you just need to be able to interpret these values and figure out the percent. So the total that come from fossil fuels, and in this case, is coal and natural gas, is 56 plus 24, which is 80. And the total, if you add them all the numbers, is going to be 117. So 80 over 117 is the fraction that comes from fossil fuels. And you can calculate that fraction and get it as a decimal, which is 0.68, which is 68%. So roughly 2/3 of our electricity is coming from fossil fuels. Now, we'd like to change that. We like to build up the wind and solar, but right now it's mostly fossil fuels. Notice that you have to be able to go from fractions to decimals, percents. That's a basic math operation that I think the student has to be able to be comfortable with. Certainly they need it for the math test, and this could easily show up on the social studies or the science test. So you have to be able to go from fractions, decimals, percents, and know how to go back and forth between them. And sometimes the calculator can do that automatically, but you ought to have a good intuitive feel for how to do that. So that's the kind of thing you're going to have to be able to do for the vast majority of the questions, is just be able to interpret data. Here's another one. This might come from the economics section of the social studies. 2023 vehicle sales from U.S. companies and millions of vehicles. For our purposes, I'm going to say Chrysler is a U.S. company. And they give you a pie chart. And the goal is to interpret a pie chart. And maybe they might give you the pie chart and a little story about the car companies. And then they'd ask what percent of U.S. vehicles come from General Motors. Okay, so 2.4 million vehicles divided by the total number sold, which is the sum of those three. And again, going from fractions to percent to decimal, you have to be able to go back and forth. That's really the heart of the math that you're going to have to be able to do. It's not a lot of advanced mathematics, but it is using math to be able to interpret data.
Would this be a multiple choice question, do you think?
Boy, sometimes they ask multiple choice questions. There might be several multiple choice questions based on one sort of page of reading with some data. And this could be a multiple choice question, in which case you might be able to get some hint from the number of possible answers. But I don't know for sure what fraction of the questions are multiple choice on the science and social studies. Okay, other questions?
So in science,
yeah.
there's nothing like calculating forces or acceleration and velocity or any of that?
There is going to be some of that, and we're going to come to that in just a second.
Okay.
You won't have to memorize those equations, but you might have to use those equations. I think that's not quite as common as interpreting the data, but I think it's still a fairly common thing you'd have to do. But one more question about interpreting the data. This is related to climate change. They have the time series. The temperature, average temperature as a function of time over the last 170 years or so. And you have to, they have the average here, which averages, and they subtracted out the average. So it's about 0 or a little lower around 1850. And then the question is, by how much did the global average rise between 1850 and 2023? So it's gotten up to around 1.4. So the rise is around 1.4 or 1.5. So it's really just knowing how to interpret plots. In this case, it is a multiple choice. And if the answers aren't exact, you take the closest one. But it's really a matter of being able to interpret these plots. Okay. All right. One thing that will come up, and especially in the science part, is the units. Generally, science is done using metric units. So they want to be familiar with the units of mass, which is the kilogram, distance is the meter, and time is the second. There is an older system of metric units based on the gram, centimeter, and second that sometimes shows up in the medical literature still, but is somewhat obsolete in the sciences. And these units often will use prefixes. So they'll use especially these middle four prefixes. So for instance, if you're talking about frequency, number of oscillations per second, now that oscillation per second, one oscillation per second is 1 hertz. That's the unit. And if you had 1,000 oscillations per second, that'd be 1,000 hertz, which would be a megahertz. So a mega is the prefix that corresponds to, excuse me, a million. A million's 10 to the 6, and mega is often, the symbol is capital M. So capital M and then hertz, HZ, would be megahertz. That was how you use these prefixes. And it's good to know. I think the students should know at least these middle four. Mega for a million, kilo for 1,000, milli for 1/1000th, which is 10 to the minus 3, and micro for 1/1,000,000th, which is 10 to the minus 6. For instance, if you go out and run a 5K race, you're running 5 kilometers or kilometers. So that's 5,000 meters in your race. If you have a dime has a thickness of about 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter is about is 1/1000th of a meter. So it's small m. Notice milli is small m, mega is big M. So it kind of makes a difference whether you use uppercase and lowercase with these prefixes. Micro is a Greek letter, the Greek mu. So you got to be careful. Sometimes text will get translated incorrectly or fonts won't be right. You got to be careful. It's Greek mu is the micro. And there's other of these prefixes that go outside these ranges, but the most of them, if you use these 6, you'd be in pretty good shape. And the other thing that you need to do, because data might be given in the science section and scientific notation. So for instance, the speed of light is roughly 300 million meters per second. Well, if you take the decimal point, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you count the decimal point over, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 places, you'll get 3 points. So 3 times 10 raised to the 8th power, 10 to the 8th meters per second. That's written in scientific notation. You want to be able to go back and forth between normal notation and scientific. That is probably as important as any sort of mathematical operation in interpreting numbers on the science section. You need to be comfortable with scientific notation. Another example, the Bohr radius. It's a real small number, 0.000000000053 meters. Oops, it shouldn't be meters per second. It should be just meters. It's a typo. Meters. Well, again, if you move your decimal point over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 points, you'll reach 5.3, and then it'd be times 10 to the minus 11. So the Bohr radius is 5.3 times 10 to the minus 11 meters. So you want to be comfortable going back and forth. And if you move the decimal point over 9 spaces, you'd have 0.053 times 10 to the minus 9 meters, which would be 0.053 nanometers. So you need to go back and forth. Incidentally, if you're not familiar with the Bohr radius, A Bohr radius is about the size of a normal molecule. A tenth of the Bohr radius is a typical atom size. Bohr radius is sort of a glucose molecule or something size. So that's a little tutorial on units. And I think you need to be comfortable with units, and you probably should have the student memorize at least those middle four metric prefixes so that they'll just be able to make sense out of these numbers. And they should maybe have a little practice on scientific notation. So when they see something like 3 times 10 to the 8th, they at least know what it means. Your calculator should be able to do that, help you with that. Sometimes the calculator can do it automatically, but you have to know how your calculator works. So it's another example where your calculator, you need to have a little practice with it beforehand. Okay, now back to your question about math formulas. They do show up sometimes, especially on the science part, especially on the physics part, the physical sciences. So here's an example. They don't really have to memorize the math formula. Usually they're given. So the text may say the weight W is equal to the mass M times the acceleration of gravity, where W equals mg and g is 9.8 meters per second. Now, the test wouldn't ask you to know W equals mg, even though that's a pretty easy equation to have. It definitely wouldn't ask you to memorize what the acceleration of gravity is. But if they give you the formula, you should be able to interpret it and do some calculations with it. If they have mg, that usually implies there's multiplication. Unless there's a plus sign or something, you should assume multiplication if it's just two variables next to each other. So mass, which is what was the weight of a person whose mass is 70 kilograms. 70 kilograms times 9.8 meters per second, which would be given, I'm sure, in the problem, would equal 686 kilograms meters per second squared. Now, the metric system often gives nicknames, basically to make life easier and to honor famous scientists. And a kilogram meters per second squared, the nickname of that's a Newton. So it's 686 newtons. You could do this calculation on your calculator, or you could approximate 9.8 as 10 and just do 70 times 10 or 700. And you know that the answer is going to be slightly less than 700. So it's good to do some of the math in your head just so you don't make some colossal mistake where you type numbers into the calculator wrong. You don't realize it. Okay. Another example. This one's from electricity. Ohm's law. Again, you don't have to, if you're spending your time with your student memorizing what these equations are, what's Ohm's law, you're probably not the best use of your time. But if they're given the equation and given what these various quantities mean, you need to be able to do a calculation. And Ohm's law is basically V equals IR. Voltage is equal to current times resistance. But if you're given the resistance and the voltage and asked for the current, you may have to solve this equation for I, which just basically means dividing both sides by R. I don't think there's going to be much algebra that's harder than this on the test, but you should be comfortable if you have V equals IR being able to solve it for the current, or weight is mg. You could calculate what G is if you just knew the weight and the mass. You want to be able to do that much. The units in electricity are really kind of complicated, but if current is voltage over resistance, that's 6 volts divided by 1,500 ohms. That's the symbol for an ohm, is 0.004 volts per ohm. A volt per ohm is an amp. And if you have 0.004 amps, then if you wanted to go to what that metric prefix is, it's 1, 2, 3, it's 4 times 10 to the minus 3 amps. It's 4 milliamps. So yeah, you don't need to memorize the equation and what's Ohm's law, but you need to be able to use it. And to be able to use it, you have to be comfortable with these things like units, like scientific notation, those kind of things. All right, another example. unless there's a question. Let me pause for a second. Okay. Another example, kinetic energy of an object with a mass m and speed v is 1/2 mv squared. Now, this is an example that requires a little bit higher level. Well, this example is pretty much plug in. If the object has a mass of 12 kilograms and a speed of 6 meters per second, what is its kinetic energy? Well, it's 1/2 times the mass, 6 kilograms, times 6 meters per second, quantity squared. 1/2 times 12 is 6, so it's just 6 times 6 times 6. Remember that the units get squared as well as the number. So it's 216 kilograms meters squared per second squared. And again, that has a nickname. It's a joule, J. So energy is given in joules. That's another example of how you might have to calculate something on the test. Here's an example that's a little higher level. You have the same thing. Kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared, where m is the mass, v is the speed. Suppose you double the speed. What happens to the kinetic energy? Well, now you have energy is 1/2 m, and you doubled the speed. So the new speed is 2 times the original speed, v. And that whole thing's squared. Now here you have to know a little bit about how exponents work. That's 1/2 m times 2 squared times v squared. So AB quantity squared is a squared times b squared. And then you can just move the 2 squared, which is 4, outside, and you get 4 times your original kinetic energy. So the kinetic energy goes up by a factor of 4. And that one's a little more abstract. I don't think there'll be a lot of questions like that on the science test, but I think that level of question is fair game. There's all kinds of equations that could come up. There's a whole bunch of them. I won't even go through all of these. You don't have to memorize any of these. You don't have to go over and have your student memorizing these equations. You just need to be able to use them.
I believe they're at the start of the test, they give you a page of all the equations that might be used.
Do they? I didn't know that for the science.
Yeah,
I know that's true for the math, but I didn't know about the science. Okay. Well, that would be useful. And if they do have that, then you can find it online. It'd be a good thing to have your student become familiar with. I wasn't aware of it. Okay. Other questions before I move on? All right. This chemical reactions aren't really math, but there's kind of some math in them. Reactions have to be balanced. The number of molecules on each side has to be the same. So for instance, if you glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide and water, that's basically what our bodies do when we eat sugars. You have to have the same number of oxygen molecules on each side. So the subscript 6 means there's 6 oxygen in the molecule glucose. And the number out front is the number of molecules you have. So you have 1 glucose molecule with 6 oxygen molecules, each one with 2. So 6 times 2, there's 12 oxygen here, and 6 there, 18 on the left. And in carbon dioxide, there's 12, 6 times 2, and there's 6 in the oxygen, so you have 18 on the right. So balancing chemical reactions has a little bit of math, and that could show up on the chemistry part. Probability. We talked about statistics. You could get a little bit of probability. For instance, roll 2 dice. What's the probability you'll get an 8? Well, you roll 1 dice, and there's 6 possibilities. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You roll the second dice, there's 6 possibilities. And you add up the numbers, total number, and there's 5 ways you can get 8. You can get 6 on the first dice, and 2 on the second, 5 on the first, 3 on the second, 4 and 4. You could get 3 on the first dice and 5 on the second. They're 2 different dice, and 6 and 2. So there's a total of 5 ways. So the definition of the probability is the number of ways you can get the quantity you're interested in, 8, divided by the total number of ways, and there's 6 by 6, there's 36 possibilities. So the probability comes out to 14%. And it's, again, you got to be comfortable going fractions to percents to decimals. Okay. Now, another couple things that come up in probability is if you have two probable events that are mutually exclusive. They both can't happen. One happens or the other. For instance, roll 2 dice and you get a snake eyes, which is 1, 1, or roll 2 dice and get boxcars, which is 6, and then 6 on the other. Well, you can't get both of those. You're either going to get one or the other. So when you have one chance out of 36 to get snake eyes and one chance out of 36 to get boxcars, when they're mutually exclusive events, if you want to know the chance of getting one or the other, you just add the two. So you get, in this case, 136 plus 136, or you get around 6%. Usually when you're dealing with mutually exclusive events and probability, the word or comes in. But you can also have the word and come in. The probability of getting 6 on one dice, say the red dice, and a 4 on the other dice, a blue dice. Well, roll 1 dice and you roll the other dice. Those are 2 independent events, totally independent of each other. If you want the total probability, you multiply the 2. So the probability of getting a 6 on the first dice, I'll say the red dice, is 1 out of 6. And the probability of getting 4 on the blue dice is 1 out of 6. So the total probability is the product. So I wrote it in the times symbol explicitly, which is now 1 out of 36, or 3%. And you oftentimes with independent events, you'll see and usually means you multiply the 2. Okay, here's a little bit of math you could get from biology. This is called a Punnett square. This has to do with genetics. Suppose you had some disease that had 2 genes, a dominant gene and a recessive gene. And if you have a copy of the dominant gene, you're safe. And if you have all copies of the recessive gene, you have some illness. Now, everybody's got 2 copies of their genes, one from their father, one from their mother. So the father, we're going to assume the father is what's called a carrier, has a dominant gene and a recessive gene. So this person's not sick. You have to have 2 recessive genes to be sick. He's got a dominant gene, so he's a healthy father, but he has one of the recessive genes as well as the dominant. Mother's also a carrier. Now they have kids. What could happen? Well, they could both get a fourth of their kids on average will get 2 copies of the dominant gene. They'll be healthy and their kids will be healthy and everything's great. There's 2 out of 4 chances that they're going to be the children will be carriers themselves. They won't be sick. They'll have the dominant gene. They won't be sick, but they will be possible to pass that recessive gene on to the grandchildren. And then 1 chance out of 4, so 25%, that they'll get a recessive gene from their father and from their mother, and then they'll have the illness. So what fraction of the offspring will have the disease? 25%. That's how these Punnett squares work. They're kind of probability in disguise. So that, whether you say that's math or not, I guess it's a little bit of math, but it's mainly biology. Okay, so they have 25% chance of the kids being sick, and you could find other cases that you could do. You work out the Punnett squares to find out how it works. Now, some of the things I've read had said that there might be combinations and permutations on the social studies and science tests. I kind of doubt it, but since some of the reading that I did implied that it's possible, I'm going to go over it real quick. And so a combination, you have to select 2 objects out of a set of 4. So you have to select 2 people out of a list of 4 people. You have to set 2 out of 4. Let's just call them A, B, C, D. You have to take 2 of them out. When it's a combination, order doesn't matter. So if order doesn't matter, then what I do is I suggest you just list out all the possibilities in some systematic way. You could take A first, and then your other choice could be B, C, or D. You could take B first, then your other choices are A, C, or D, but A, B, B, A, they're the same. Order doesn't matter for combinations. So you really only get B, C, and B, D. You could take C first, And then the only new information you get, you can't have CC because you take C and then you only have A, B, and D left to choose from. So you have C, D, and that's it. That's the only possibilities. So 6 ways. So if they ask you the number of ways, the number of combinations of selecting 2 objects out of a set of 4, you can just list them. You're probably thinking, what if they ask me, 31 objects out of a set of 153? They're not going to do it. There are ways to do this and more systematically using higher order math functions, but I think the chances of those being on the science or social studies test are so remote. I think you ignore them. I just list the ways. Now, what's a permutation? Permutation is when the order does matter. So for instance, you have 4 people in a club. They want to select the president and the vice president. Well, the first person is going to be they select is the president. Second person is the vice president. So if they have A, B, C, D as their 4 choices, they could take A is the president and B is the vice president, or B is the president, A is the vice president. Those are now different. So if order matters, you're dealing with permutations. Again, you could list them all out, but now you list the original 6 and then you switch the order and you get another 6, you get 12 ways. Another way to do it is to say you got 4 choices for president. Once you choose the president, you got 3 choices left for vice president. There's 12 choices. So again, I don't think combinations and permutations are going to come up, but they might. Right, well, that's pretty much all the math that I've seen listed on the social studies and the science parts of the GED. But do you all have questions about what else might appear? What things you were worried about? Things that, just questions in general.
No, but a comment, to me, it's pretty clear that a student needs to get through the math part before they start those other ones.
Perhaps, although you'll find that there's a math test, there's a lot more math. So if you went through and if you look at the video from August, or if you look at what's on the math test, you may come to a different conclusion. I mean, they need to know some things about scientific notation, exponent, a few things, but the 95% of the math that's on the math section, they don't need. So I can see your point, but you might think differently if you looked at the math test carefully. Other questions? Warren, did I forget anything?
No, I think you did a very good job. I'm sorry that I was late. Our furnace went out and we're getting estimates from other people.
Okay, well, it's that time of the year when you don't want to lose your furnace. Other question, did you accomplish your goals, the goals that we had talked about at the beginning? Did people feel like they had their questions answered? Anything else?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's all I really had for the presentation. I knew this wasn't going to take a whole long time because there's just not that much math on the science and the social studies. But I guess one thing I would say in conclusion is don't spend all your time with studying for the science test, memorizing equations. You don't need to do that. It's interesting. In fact, if you can take some of these practice exams yourself to kind of get an idea what's on there, it really is mostly a page of text, maybe with some data embedded, and you need to be able to interpret that. And when you think about it, that's really what you need to be able to do in life, more than memorize what Ohm's law is. You really need to be able to read something, interpret it, using have enough math to be able to do that.
So one thing that I'd just like to point out, for the testing, what we do is we try to make sure the student is ready to take a test, especially, the actual subject area test. So they take practice tests, they take a practice test in essential ed, and then also if that is acceptable, then they can take the GED ready test. But a situation happened last week where the student scored a 146 and a 145 is passing. However, it was math. And when the student went on to take the actual subject area test, they scored a 139. So sometimes, you know, you really need a little extra like that. I think the practice test should be a little bit stronger in most cases for the student to make sure the student is confident in passing, because once it's right there at 145 or 146, you know, you may get a totally different set of questions, and you know, and then you don't want the student to be discouraged after that happens. So I think that now I'm going to try to talk to the students so that they understand, because the actual ready test and practice test does say that they're ready, even though it's 1 point over. So I think that's what I'm going to try to, you know, just point out to them before they actually take the test, because he was really sad after that.
Yeah.
He was really, you know, after that pass. And I felt bad, really bad.
Frustrating.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, with the math tests, I've made several practice math tests for my student. In fact, some of them you can see you can get with the August video when I talked about what's on the math test. It'd be a lot harder to make practice tests, I think, for social studies and science, because you have to make these kind of elaborate text. And so I think you're going to have a little bit harder time just creating your own sort of practice tests. But on the other hand, they can really need that practice. There's no use going through just a lot of short answer stuff if what they really have to do on that test is to interpret, you know, text, paragraphs of text. So yeah, to find a way, either finding stuff online or something to find those kind of tests to practice with your student, even before they start taking the practice tests, official practice tests.
So back to Leslie's question about the order. Is it recommended that, I think that it's recommended that you start with reading and then is math next in the.
Okay, so Carol, ideally, we take a look at what the students, they take the CASAS test. So in an ideal situation, you will have, in the ideal situation is we have enough tutors, you know, in all areas, which oftentimes that's not the case. So sometimes if a student does score like higher in reading, it would be nice for them to take the reading test first, because then that way it won't be that long, hopefully, for them to pass, because they already are at a higher level. However, sometimes when we don't have enough reading tutors, they go to math, because eventually they have to take them all anyway.
And you just take one subject at a time, you don't take them all together?
Yes, since I've been here, previously I worked as a principal for most of my life. However, I worked as a GED administrator for Sir Metro. And most students do best when they're concentrating on one subject area at a time, as opposed to when I came, some students were kind of dibbling and dabbling.
I do it all.
And then no one ever was moving forward. So we put all of our eggs in that one basket, you know, work on that, try different strategies, because essential ed is awesome. And for essential ed, I would definitely recommend that they take their individual learning plan, and then they take each and every one of those skills, or either they quiz out, like if you know the material, let's just quiz out and move to the next, because our students have a lot of gaps. And this way, if you take the learning plan and you take each, and you go through each and every one, you'll more than likely eliminate any gaps that you have. Maybe the gap was in elementary school.
Yeah.
And if you hop around, you won't address the gap.
Okay.
Let me ask.
Well, I didn't realize that you took one test at a time. I thought you had to take like the GED was a comprehensive, all the subjects at once, but.
No, just one at a time.
So that's good. That seems good.
Do the tests ever expire? I mean, could you take could you take the reading test and then 3 years later take the math test? Or okay, so
Yes, you
there,
can.
you can, okay.
Mhm,
And
you
also,
def-
I personally, going back to your question about the order, I think there's less math on the social studies than on the science. So it might make sense to take social studies second after reading, because they're very little math. You know, they still
But
ought to be
then
able to
if
do
they don't know mean, median, mode, and range,
that,
or
or
how to do a
fraction.
percentage or something like that, then that could hurt them, right?
That could, you'd have to be willing to spend a small time on the math, but it just seems to me like that would be, if you wanted to get the next test with the least math, I think it'd be the social studies. And if you were willing to spend, you know, a month doing that little bit of math that's on the social studies, you could probably spend the rest of your time. The social studies would be a good choice, in my opinion, but I haven't actually taken the tests. So in some ways it'd be nice if I went out and I took the test, so I really knew what I was talking about, but you know, they cost money and I haven't done that yet. But yeah, I think you could make an argument that social studies would be a good choice for the second test.
And then what is the way they learn social studies? Is it only through essential ed, or are there other materials to teach social?
we have resources here, and then also embedded in some of the reading is social
Yeah.
studies. And,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but if there's a lot of US history and you don't know US history, it seems like you would need to somehow learn that.
Yes, but again, these questions tend to be like the Gettysburg thing, the Civil War thing I gave at the beginning. You don't have to know a lot of facts about US history. You have to be able to know enough to be able to read a paragraph and sort of
Oh, okay.
interpret that
Okay.
without having to know all the facts. So in fact, I sometimes have gotten out of the library the great big thick GED books they have from the Princeton Review. Those are helpful, and I wouldn't buy
Okay.
one
All
because
right,
they're
thank you.
expensive.
That's a
But
good
go to the
suggestion.
library, just thumb through them. They can give you a really good idea of what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
And those questions are all generated like randomly. So it really depends upon when you go to test, you know, what your test looks like. Because
Yeah.
we've had students, believe it or not, to just on a whim go take it and pass it.
Okay.
Did you have a question, Niharika?
Hi, sorry I'm late. I just was talking to Lori yesterday, and she mentioned that I should join the session as I'm, planning to start as a math tutor. So, I appreciate your doing this. So, my question might be a little bit more fundamental, which is, so does the same tutor sort of help the students with, English, math, social studies, or how would that work?
We want the
Yeah,
tutor to
prefer
be
that, yeah.
in their comfort level. Like we do have some tutors that can tutor in both the reading and math areas. However, once the student passes, like for instance, if you're the reading tutor, and if you're not comfortable, then they'll be reassigned to someone else.
Okay.
For
What
math.
happens if a student passes the reading and the math? Do you still have people who can help them with the other two, or is that, I mean, with the
Yes,
reading?
because usually the reading and social studies kind of go hand in hand, and so
Mhm.
does the science and the math. So that's usually how it is.
Okay.
And is math generally the topic that the students need the most help?
Yes, that's when they come in, the first test they take to see where they are is the CASAS test. And generally the math for the CASAS is lower than the reading in most cases. However, lately I've had a couple of students that they were kind of equal. On a high level, which was good. So hopefully they'll finish. It won't take as long for, that particular student.
And how do you find, teaching math virtually? Any sort of suggestions, tips on that?
Well, the Oakland Literacy Council has some nice software that allows you to basically have PDFs made where you can both write on them and the student
Okay.
can write using the computer. And I found I've only taught it virtually. I've never taught it in person, at least not for an Oakland Literacy Council. And I found it very effective if you can get it set up. So, I mean, there's a little bit of a learning curve to get used to the software. But once you're up and rolling, I find it works great to do it virtual. That
Awesome.
being said,
So
it's
how do
both
you
and the-
learn that? Is there a session to teach how to do that? How to get set up?
I learned it from the previous math person at OLC. I think they probably would give you some instruction. It's not in the video I did last.
Right, it's not in the video.
So yeah, you talk to Pat and Pat would find a way for you to learn that.
Yes, we can definitely work it out.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, well, it's 1:02, so I guess that's about it, but it's been a pleasure. And again, feel free to email me if you have questions, email Pat or, whatever we can do. Well, thank you and good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot.